I'm Rosemary McDaniel, and I was born in Elkhart, Indiana in 1942. Every year we would come to the homecoming because it was held down on Main Street, and that was just the greatest and the best thing. And so from an early age I was just fascinated by Bristol because we went to the cemeteries, and he had all the history things, so how could I not love it? I think it's interesting to see what other people remember about Bristol, because I think before Facebook there was really no place to share the things that we all knew, but now there's Facebook, which maybe some people don't like, but Facebook gives you the opportunity to share pictures, to share information, and it's really something good. I know that a lot of people don't like Facebook, but if you use it for the right things, it's good. Well, I was coming to Bristol a lot because I was doing the Bristol Sun, and my husband said, why don't we just move to Bristol? I said, well, that's good. We need to find some place to move to. The funeral home was up for sale. So I thought, that's interesting. Well, my friend Lucy was a realtor, and I called her, and the sign had just gone up. But the funny part was they put the sign across the street. They didn't put it here, they put it across the street. So Lucy came that evening to meet my husband and I. We came here, we saw the house and everything, and we talked about how much, and it was a lot less than you would think it would be because it's a really big property, but because it's a funeral home, nobody would probably want to buy it. So we bought it that night. Nobody else ever got to see it because we bought it. The funeral home was built by Mr. Hilbish. He built it, first it was a home. He built it to live here, and I have a picture of it about 1900 where it had just become a funeral home because they had the horses and the carriage out in front of it. But it was just a fascinating thing it was big. My husband wanted to live in a big house. We lived in the Simonson house in Elkhart, which is about half the size of this. So we preferred something bigger, something with a history. The name of the funeral home was Stem Lawson Peterson, and they were selling it because they had built another one by Martin's on Bristol Street, and they were going to be consolidating the one here with the one there because they had no longer done embalming or anything here. They only had funerals here from about 1978 they moved here, and they only did funerals here. They didn't do any embalming or anything here. Not personally me, but now Penny and some other people have said that there's something here. When we first came here, I had some people from a paranormal group come in, and they went over to the bathrooms and they said that's where the spirits hang out, and if it gets too noisy they go out to the garage, which is a library too. And the best thing that I can remember is my friend Betty was here, and we were having a meeting, and she was thirsty, and I didn't have any water down here then. I said, well, go upstairs and get yourself a bottle of water. So she went upstairs, and she came down with the bottle of water, and she said, oh, Rosemary, I'm sorry, I didn't know you had company. I said, I don't, except down here. She goes, well, there was a lady sitting in your chair up there with red hair, and she turned around and smiled at me, and I said, oh, hi, I'm sorry, I didn't know Rosemary had company. So, of course, we had to get out pictures, and we figured out that what she had seen was the daughter-in-law of Mr. Hilbish, who his two sons, she had married one of the sons, and she was a Sherwin, and she had lived here for a while. And we figured out that Ada Sherwin Hilbish was who it was. My Uncle Richard, I did not know personally. He died in 1901. And in fact, I didn't even know about that until I had moved to Bristol and was looking through newspapers and obituaries and that kind of thing. And I found that he died in 1901 because he got into an argument with the owner of a livery stable across the street. He had a livery stable here about where the Bristol phone company is. And apparently they got into some kind of an argument in the middle of the street, and the son came out with some kind of a stick or a bat or something and hit Richard over the head, and he fell down in front of Bickle hardware store, and then later he died. My grandfather had to go and get a lawyer in Elkhart. He took the train to Elkhart, and the boy was convicted of killing Richard Sherwin in 1901, and he went to prison for a few years, and that was all. But it was really sad because Richard Sherwin was someone who owned a lot of property in Bristol and was really someone who could have really done a lot for Bristol, so it was kind of sad. It was interesting that I met John Niemeyer, and we were friends and talked about history. And one afternoon, we were leaving, Penny and I were leaving the restaurant, and he came in with this picture. And he said, "Look at this picture. This is a picture of our old hardware store, and there's an X on the sidewalk, and that shows where a man was killed." And I said, "Yes, that was where my grand-uncle was killed by the man that came across the street from the other livery stable and hit him on the head. His son hit him on the head, and he died a couple of days after they had done that. And I didn't even know about him. I hadn't even heard anything about him, and I happened to see it in the Bristol Banner. And then I went looking to see the information, because my father had never told me anything about it. Well, yes, because that building is gone. That actually was the building that was there. It was a hardware store, and by the time he brought me to show me the picture, the store was gone. It's interesting that it was always said that the Sangers never ate any kind of dairy. They certainly did not have any kind of dairy. My grandfather, who was the gentleman who had all the cows, loved dairy, loved doing that, loved raised cows. In fact, he even had charts, like you see family charts for people now. He had charts like that for his cows. So he was really into his cows. And he died of tuberculosis. And the interesting point was that it was always said that the Sherwins, had cows, had milk, had dairy, whereas the Sangers would never have any kind of dairy. They wouldn't drink milk, they wouldn't eat cheese, they wouldn't eat butter, and I never knew why until I started thinking about it and realized that at least my grandfather and some of the other family had died of tuberculosis. And it came from having the milk and the dairy that they ate was infected with it, and that's what happened to them. But I never realized that was it. There were actually 2 fires and the interesting thing is that the belief was in the town that at least one of the fires, and maybe both of them, were started by the man who had his own mill on the river, and also the Bristol people had mills and things, sawdust mills, etc., down by the river, and it blocked off his dam, and so he was always upset with that. And when the fires happened in Bristol, it was believed by many people that he was the one that started the fires. And there were actually 3 fires that year, and they believe that he was responsible for those fires. Now, there was another hotel in Bristol, too, that was over on the corner of 15 and 120. And that burned, too, but it had nothing to do with that one. But I remember that a friend of mine had asked me to look it up because relatives of hers had owned it, and they took how the people had to run out in their night clothes because the hotel was on fire. It eventually burned. The two-story privy. There was, I believe it was a pool hall in front, and behind it was the, and it's still there, it was the house that was a bed and breakfast for some time. But before it was a bed and breakfast, it was owned by a family, and the family had the two-story privy built, and the upper one went to the house, and the lower one went to, I believe it was a pool hall, and that way the family didn't have to be bothered by the people from the business. Well, those were interesting old buildings. They had been apparently a number of things. I think one was a grocery store at one time. I think one was, actually I think there was another building in between the two stores that was actually where some gentlemen skinned animals for the pelts, and that was gone. And then they had like a grocery store, a little freezer store, and those buildings all were taken down when the church bought the building on the corner, and they didn't want all those buildings behind it. And actually, they tore down the house that was there. And the house was interesting because supposedly the story was that Daniel Boone had slept there. Well, the actual story was, the fact was, his cousin was married to the gentleman that owned that house, and she slept there. But I looked it up, and Daniel Boone died like 20 or 30 years before that house was even built. So there was no way that Daniel Boone slept there. But it was really a kind of a cool house. I have pictures of it. It was pink and gray, and I had even toured it before they tore it down. But the people that owned it were renting it to people, and they took me in to see it. And it was pretty deteriorated because of all the people that lived there. So eventually the church bought the whole corner, and they bought that building and the buildings that were behind it, and they tore all those down, and then it became kind of the parking lot and the park for the church building that was on the corner. Okay, on the corner of 15 and 120 is the building that is still there, that is now belongs to the church, and it's kind of the place that they have events or whatever. And originally that building was the hardware store, and it was also became a gun store, etc. But that building is still there. But the other buildings behind it were all torn down, and even the house that was there was torn down. Okay, the most interesting historical places in Bristol include, of course, the Opera House, which has been completely redone inside so that, you know, it's a more, it's a better place for people to come to see the theater. But the problem is they spent like $10,000 or something to upgrade the inside of the Opera House, while the outside is not looking good at all. And hopefully someone will give them money to take care of that Opera House. The other buildings there are like the Redbird, which has been there a long, long time, but because of the paint that they used on the side of the building has an issue with some of the bricks on that side of that building. So that's an issue. The old store now has become dilapidated. It needs to be taken care of. It's one of the worst looking buildings in Bristol. Hopefully that will be probably have to be torn down, because when we had the really bad floods and rain a few years ago, the back of the building sunk into the ground. So eventually I think that building is going to have to go. But it's a fascinating place there. It's too bad that the places are gone, because they were really, in the past, fascinating. Well, the most interesting modern places in Bristol now, I understand they're making a restaurant out of the old Chase Bank, so that's kind of interesting. I think the funeral home is interesting because I think we have done a lot to it. The downstairs is now like a meeting place, and where history and genealogy things are stored. Yeah, the new police station and the fire station and the town hall was all done over, and that was considered by many people to be a waste of the money. But I think that has all gone away now, and people realize that it's a good place to have the town meetings and have the town offices. Okay, where the housing development is now, that actually is where the buildings were. That's where the mills were, and they had a 5-story furniture building there. They had a sawmill. They had a couple of mills, but they got into, and they actually had a conglomerate of people that were interested in trying to keep that going. But the problem was, there was a gentleman who had another mill down toward the east. They were toward the west, and he complained that what they had there was ruining what he had. So a few years later, when there were 3 downtown fires, they felt that he perhaps had something to do with those fires, because then the sawmill and the furniture store and all the things they had were burned too. So it was just all gone. I would like to see Bristol become a place where there were actually places downtown you could shop. I mean, once upon a time there was a drugstore, there was a little dime store, there were other places, and it seems that now there's a quilt shop and a couple restaurants, but there really is not any place to shop in Bristol. And I think it's a shame. And the old store that was for years, and from the 20s at least until the 70s, it was the grocery store that everybody went to. And it's just kind of a shame that there just aren't more places now, you know. Hopefully that we can take some of the old places and make them into new places and find ways to bring more stores downtown. I love Bristol. I always have, because my father came from Bristol. Actually, they lived out near Bonneville, and he had many friends and neighbors there, and they exchanged pictures. So I have pictures of many people that lived out in the area, and I've put them up on Facebook to share them, because it's just such an interesting thing that he had saved all the things about Bristol and handed them down to me, and I'm sharing them. The Bristol, Indiana Heritage Society was Jack Watson and Penny Bucks and Linda Powell and I decided to start this thing we call the Indiana Heritage Society, because we for a few times had people come here to the funeral home. We have a lot of room downstairs. We put chairs out, and we had people come to tell us history, and it was really well done. And the last one we had last month was at the library because we were redoing the floor and everything in the funeral home, but we will have it back here. And it's some place for people to come and talk about the history of Bristol, and for us to have a website and information to have people go and look at the history of Bristol. And thanks to Larry App, we are getting that, actually some film now for that. So it's kind of cool.